Thanks everyone for coming out. I want to re-extend the thanks that Laurie's already said to all of you who have helped with funding, in-kind support, who made it possible for us to do this research. I'm having a lot of fun and I'm learning a lot. I also want to say that I've had the opportunity to present to industrial partners, stakeholders, government agencies, and so on a number of times. And almost every time that I have done it, I have got the same response, which is, yeah, we knew that already. So what we are trying to do is to quantify what you guys have learned instinctively from working in this field for 15 or 20 years, so that we can train the next generation of your bosses so that they can start you off knowing what you've learned over 15 years, from that position. So what science, in many cases, just does is quantify what you guys with boots and shovels already know. My thinking about fire science has been enhanced through conversations with a whole ton of people. A few of them are represented here, but I want to single out in particular Hélène Marcoux, who is Laurie's master's student, and Eric De Silva, who is my master's student, who did a lot of work on the predecessor to this project and have yielded many of the insights that we'll actually present to you today, because we're still on the stage of learning on what we're going to learn from this project. I've got kind of 5 themes that I want to touch on. The concept of the fire regime, how this has led to 2 cultures within fire ecology that have ultimately, I think, hindered progress in understanding mixed severity fires. I'll talk a little bit about mixed severity, what I'm calling the mixed severity challenge, why it is so difficult to work in these landscapes and why I think people have historically avoided working in these landscapes. And then a few of the questions that we're hoping to resolve, at least for this part of the world with the research that we're doing. And I'm going to leave you with a very brief overview of what I see as being some of the management challenges and some of the management opportunities. My expectation is that you guys will know a whole lot more about that than I will, and hopefully we'll have a chance to have a bit of a dialogue about that before the day and tomorrow we're done. So the concept of the fire regime. This is an idea that we use to characterize any sort of disturbance regime, really. We can apply it to ice, to wind, to drought, to insects, but it's really probably best developed in the context of fire science. So we can talk about the type of disturbance, and for today we're just going to be talking about fire, but there are many more disturbance types that we could apply this to. We would then like to know, for example, how frequently does fire occur in terms of mean fire return interval or characteristic fire cycle, just sort of how long do you have between subsequent disturbance events? How intense are these fires? So how we can characterize them in terms of kilojoules of output or flame length. So intensity, how severe is the fire basically? How big is it? What season does it occur in? That has a huge impact on deciduous vegetation. When I'm working on fires in Algonquin Provincial Park, where we've got a lot of maple, fires that occur in early spring or in late fall have a very, very different effect than fires that occur in midsummer for the same frequency, intensity, and severity. And then we're really starting to appreciate the importance of variability in the fire regime. So knowing just the mean return interval often does not achieve the restoration targets that we're aiming for. You might need a short period of time in which you've got a lot of fires followed by a long fire-free interval, or vice versa, to achieve any particular target that you're aiming for. In general, we have historically focused on 2 prevailing fire regimes. One of high-frequency, low-severity fires, which are typically these surface fires or the friendly flame that comes in and cleans out the understory, or these low-frequency, high-severity fires that are more typical of the boreal forest. And these have actually led to these 2 cultures that I'm going to talk about. So this is what a typical, healthy, high-frequency, low-severity stand might look like. You can see very few branches low down on these trees. They have thick bark, very little fuel accumulation in the understory. We've got space between canopies here so that if fire does get up into the canopy, it's unlikely to spread from tree to tree. This is a low-frequency forest being restored using fire. You can see there's quite a bit of fuel accumulation in the understory here. In theory, this fire will help consume a bunch of this fuel, kill some of the smaller trees, help kill off some of these bottom branches, and actually help protect this stand against future fires. Once we've got this under control. It's so safe, she should never turn her back on the fire. You guys all know that. But this is as testament to the low intensity and the low hazard of these high frequency, low severity fires. Okay. They are most commonly associated with ponderosa pine forests, such as the ones that I showed in the previous slides. But there are other examples across Canada. This is a Garry Oak ecosystem on Saturna Island in the Southern Gulf Islands, part of the new Gulf Islands National Park Reserve. It historically would have been characterized by high frequency, low severity fire, predominantly set by First Nations. This is the prairie forest ecotone in southern Alberta, also an environment in which low severity fire was probably critically important in maintaining the position of that boundary. And this is a black oak savanna in High Park in downtown Toronto, more or less, where they're using prescribed fire to restore the oak savanna. In the boreal forest, we have that other fire regime, so low frequency but high severity, typically largely stand replacing. These fires get up into the canopy, have near 100% mortality. They tend to be very large, and they give rise to this large-scale patchiness that's characteristic of the boreal forest. Now, some people have argued that any forest system that has a closed canopy is ultimately dominated by stand-replacing high-severity wildfires, such as the chaparral in California. I can't remember all the other examples they gave in that book. But this has led to these two cultures emerging in Canada. And so, well, not in Canada, but in fire science in North America in particular. A consequence of these sort of two endpoints in the fire regime is that we need different methods to analyze them. So low severity fires we tend to do with fire scar analysis, and I'll show you a little bit about how we do this in a bit. High severity fires we understand through stand origin mapping. And so I think that these distinct techniques, these distinct approaches, and the distinct ecosystems in which these methods have to apply have led to this scenario where we've got people who say you have to do fire science with fire scars and people who say you have to do it with stand origin mapping. And it has gotten so vicious over the years that I know one of my mentors when I was doing my PhD, Jim Agee, refused to send anything to the Canadian Journal of Forest Research because it would go to somebody in the other camp for review and they would just reject it outright. These guys don't go to the same conference as each other. Their students don't tend to meet each other. And so we've got really just, two divided camps in the history of fire ecology that I think has impeded our progress at the range where these two fire regimes come into contact with each other, where we believe mixed severity fire is probably a critically important process. Okay, so fire scar analysis. Sublethal fires, characteristic of these low severity regimes, often will scar the cambial tissue of trees without killing them. And by looking closely at the anatomy and by counting the rings back, we can figure out when fires occurred in these environments. So we can, this is just outside of Kamloops. I don't know how well it shows up. There's a nice fire scar here. There's another nice one right there that I'm cutting into. We extract partial cross sections from these trees and we can figure out the fire history. We can generate figures that look like this. Each line represents one tree. Each of these vertical bars represents a fire scar. And these gray bars represent sort of regional fire years, when lots of different trees at lots of different sites are showing evidence of fire. In stand replacing fire regimes, we don't have this physical evidence that fires have happened, but we can look for the age of the post-fire cohort and use that to figure out when the last fire was. So we go in and we make our graduate students core lots of trees. We count the rings on those, and we can use those to build up maps like this that say this, this stand originated in 1687, this one in 1726, and so on. And we can figure out what proportion of the landscape burned since any given time. And that tells us the landscape survivorship distribution. If we throw a little math at it, we can make a straight line, because we like straight lines, they're easy to work with. And this tells us about the fire cycle. And so the more fire occurs, the steeper this curve is, and we can compare two different regions to see if their fire cycle is similar. We can look for changes in the slope of this line as evidence of changes in the fire cycle. And this is how we do fire history in a stand replacing fire regime. And like I said, this has led to vicious and bitter disputes. This is, of course, the rumble in the jungle. This might be more like trouble in the forest. Some people say that the reason academic disputes are so vicious is because the stakes are so small. For whatever reason, these two camps have historically not cooperated or played well together. They acknowledged, both sides would readily acknowledge that mixed severity fire occurs, but they tend to think of it as happening just right along the edges, just where these crown fires, are put out, or where a low severity fire regime burns under unusually severe conditions or burns into adjacent forest that is more productive. The mixed severity zone was generally considered to be relatively small. It's of particular interest, though, because it tends to produce the greatest landscape complexity. So this top left figure here is an example of a prescribed burn where they're trying to achieve mixed severity effects. You can see that some of these trees are torching, but a lot of them are actually remaining intact here. And so here's a post-mixed severity fire, and you can see there's a lot of just really patchy dead trees. It almost looks more like insect outbreak or something, but it's actually a very mixed severity fire. At the bottom, this is just conceptually how that looks, and so we end up in this moderate or mixed severity fire regime with really intense spatial heterogeneity in terms of fire effects. And we believe that this has important landscape ecology implications, that this heterogeneity provides not only a larger range of habitats, but a distinct range of habitats from either of its two sort of endpoints. So we would really like to know how important mixed severity is on the landscape, where it occurs, how management efforts might have changed that, and that's where our project comes in. Sorry, more mixed severity fire here. All right, this is in the subalpine. The other was in boreal forest subalpine. The problem with doing this is that understanding the history of mixed severity fire is complicated by a number of critical factors. The first is what I'm going to call the fire exclusion bias. So we have in Western Canada fairly efficiently for almost 100 years now excluded fire from a large number of our forests. And we've done this through direct suppression efforts. I've done this through introducing sheep and cattle onto the landscape, and I'll show you what that does in a minute. And I'm not sure how prevalent it is in Alberta, but in British Columbia there was tons of selective logging where they pulled out, in particular, large pine trees to make fruit boxes with. And that made a landscape that was probably historically a mixed severity fire regime look more like one that we would consider a high severity fire regime. So stands that looked like this historically, if we put sheep or cattle on this landscape, they're consuming all of the fine fuels in the understory. So I shouldn't say all of the fine fuels. They don't like eating small conifers. They're consuming all of the grasses. And so you get loss of surface fuels. So when fire comes in, it doesn't carry, which allows all of these small trees to come up. This is an unfortunate picture. These small trees are all being killed off by drought here. But imagine that we didn't get that huge dry period in the early 2000s. And they introduce what we call ladder fuels into this system. So you can see there's still lots of these nice, fire-resistant trees here. No bottom branches, really, a long way up to the crown. We've got some surface fuels here, but we've also got now all of these smaller trees coming in, so that if fire gets into this landscape now, it can burn up these ladder fuels, get into the canopy of these large fire-resistant trees, and we've converted a surface fire regime into a crown fire regime. We can see evidence of the effects of fire suppression or fire exclusion. This is a ponderosa pine from just outside Kamloops. Each of these red arrows indicates what is probably a fire scar. The last one was in 1910, and we've got 90 years of fire-free intervals here. And almost every sample that we collected on that trip showed the same thing, about 100 years of fire-free period at the end of the record. You can see it in Eric's reconstruction that I showed you earlier from Cranbrook. No regional fires since the x-axis is missing here, but that's the 1910 fire right here as well. Another distinctive change that has been brought about by fire exclusion is a change in forest composition. So in this case here, we've got pine in the overstory and fir now growing up in the understory, probably because of fire exclusion. It's a more shade-tolerant species. We know from work that's been done, in particular in the American Northwest, but elsewhere as well, that the ignition frequency and the climatic determinants of fire differ between these two vegetation types. So long-leafed species, in particular pines, the ignition efficiency, so how likely is a fire to occur given a lightning strike, is a function principally of fuel moisture. Whereas in these short-needled forests, which are far more common around here, ignition efficiency is determined much more critically by the depth of the duff than it is by fuel moisture. Fuel moisture is obviously still important, but it's not the critical determinant. So we're changing the fire-climate relations of these forests by excluding fire. So one of the ways that we're trying to get around this fire exclusion bias is by using a hybrid approach. So I'm sure Laurie is going to talk about this more, but we're not just using one or the other method, we're using both. So any site that we go to, we look for fire-scarred trees and we collect those samples as evidence of a low-severity fire at that exact location. We collect increment core data to do stand age reconstructions and cohort detection. But the last thing that we're really conscious about doing is cutting into any downed wood that we can find to look for buried fire scars. If it's been 100 years since the last fire, it's very possible that we can look at this landscape, see absolutely no evidence of a surface fire regime, because those trees have just had 100 years to heal from the last surface fire that occurred. And we have been finding tons and tons and tons of scars like this. This is on an oak tree. There's the fire scar there. And you can actually count, it's about 10 years that it took for it to heal over to the point where there was no external evidence that a non-lethal fire had affected this tree. But in fact, if you look inside it, there is. And we're finding evidence of this all over the foothills region. So we're actually looking for, in places where people have not historically looked, for evidence of sublethal fire. And almost everywhere we're looking, we're finding it. From mountaintops to valley bottoms, we're finding evidence that fires have more mixed effects than we would historically have been led to believe using conventional approaches. The other really big challenge of working with mixed severity fires is that the methods for interpreting fire scars are really well developed. The methods for interpreting cohort data are really well developed, but they make some assumptions about how fire affects a stand. We know from visiting places that have burned at mixed severity that you can have a tree that's completely unaffected 2 meters away from a tree that experiences complete mortality, that's killed by fire. And so the scale of the mixture of severities is much finer than the minimum area we need to use the statistics that have been developed for either of these techniques. So the existing methods are simply not well developed for understanding the fire history of mixed severity forests. So we need to actually develop some new tools and techniques for interpreting the data that we're getting that are distinct from how we've done surface fire or crown fire regimes in the past. One way of getting around this is to use numerical models, and we've just started collaborating with a land surface modeler. So we're going to use his land surface model to grow vegetation and then take a fire behavior model and put that down on top of it and see what scales of fire effects we get coming out of that. Okay, burning questions. Where did mixed severity fires historically occur? We would really like to know this for ecological restoration, for developing management techniques that better emulate the natural disturbance regime. There's a whole bunch of reasons why we would like to know this, and for understanding how climate change might affect forests. So we can, and what can we do, use numerical models for this. So this is the historical natural fire regime model. This is for British Columbia. And this tells us what fire return interval we would expect to see. And the fire return interval is not exactly the same thing as the fire regime, but it's a good starting point. And so we use this in the Cranbrook area. You're seeing here the HNFR class here, the biogeoclimatic ecosystem classification system, which is a fancy way of saying dominant vegetation type, and elevation here, and we stratified our sampling approach based on these data and went in and reconstructed the fire history and fire severity at these sites. And what we found was that there were some really interesting, non-intuitive differences between the simple fire return interval as predicted by the HNFR model and fire severity as determined by fire scars and cohort establishment. And one of Laurie's master's students did some really neat work characterizing where the model gets it right and where the model gets it wrong. And one thing that gives me hope is that she actually finds there's a predictable pattern to this based on elevation and aspect. We're starting to get some skill in figuring out where the HNFR model is getting it wrong and how we can tweak that model or tweak our interpretation of its output to figure out where mixed severity fire is going to occur. Burning questions. Right. What environmental factors lead to mixed severity fires? So one thing that my master's student, Eric De Silva, did was look at climatic controls on this. So these are, he didn't exactly break it down by mixed severity fires and larger, more standard placing fires, but that's more or less how you can interpret this. And what we find is that, so this is just relationship to the Palmer Drought Severity Index. The big lines here are during the year of the fire, and these are the years before and the years after. The key take-home message here is that this line is not as big as this line. These mixed severity fires are less dependent on drought or burn during less droughty conditions than these large regional fires do. One implication of this is that when fires burn under these kinds of conditions, they're much easier to suppress than when they burn under these kinds of conditions. And so again, we're producing another bias in the record towards these large stand replacing fires as a consequence. We can look at landscape scale controls on it. This is a huge, largely stand replacing fire just outside of Nelson. But you can see there's patches in here where there was very, very mixed effects, and there are some patches like this skip at the valley bottoms here where there might have been absolutely no effects of the fire at all. It may have simply jumped right over those valley bottoms. So this is, again, where something like numerical modeling coupled with empirical data can help us predict where on the landscape or how aspect and elevation interact to produce mixed severity fires. How have land management practices changed mixed severity forests? I talked a bit about fire exclusion, but other practices, logging, road construction, and other things have also undoubtedly had an impact on the fire regime. And this is part of what Vanessa is looking at for her PhD. I won't say too much about it because I don't want to steal all the material she's got for tomorrow. But basically, she's working with this hybrid approach of fire scars and cohort data, as well as looking at lake sediments in order to reconstruct the fire regime of the foothills forest. So we're focusing on two watersheds here, which we've helpfully named ZS Road and Polecat Road after the name of the access roads. And you can see these where, there's been extensive forest management at different scales, at different elevations, and at different times within these watersheds. And so we can start to look at how land management might have changed the fire regime. And the really nice thing about adding in the lake sediments, as Mike is going to talk about, is that we can go back in time to pre-management era in a way that we can't necessarily with trees. We can look back multiple tree generations and look at how vegetation has changed on the landscape and how fire has changed on the landscape. And we can look at how those relationships might have changed during, for example, the medieval warm period 1,000 years ago, or during the Little Ice Age, maybe 200 years ago, and use that as a model for understanding how climate, ongoing climate change or climate variability, let alone future climate change, might interact with to control some of these relationships. And yes, they're doing a whole range of data collection techniques. And she wants you to know that she'll be done by next year. She'll have results to report back to you all. How can we restore mixed severity fire to modern forests? If we decide that mixed severity fire is a good thing, then we might want to start managing forests, start returning fire into these forests to achieve mixed severity effects. Well, that's not going to be as easy to do as coming around with a drip torch, because we've fundamentally changed the structure and the composition of these forests. We'll probably need to either think really carefully about what climatic conditions we want to burn under, or do mechanical pre-treatments in order to ensure that we get the survivorship that we want with the fire. It's not simply enough to just burn these things and hope that the mixed severity stuff will come back automatically. How might climate change impact the fire regime? This is obviously a huge question. There's a recent paper by Mike Flanagan. Dramatic rise in forest fires projected for Canada's west due to warming. And I've got a scary looking picture there. Almost certainly, climatic change is going to, at least in the short term, increase the likelihood of wildfire in these systems. And Laurie's going to show us later. I just saw this morning, and I don't want to steal her ideas here because I probably would mess them up anyway. But a really elegant way of understanding how this might change fire effects in systems that were historically dominated by mixed severity fire. But it's also almost certainly going to change the location where mixed severity fires will occur in the future. Places that today might be dominated by either more of a surface fire regime or more of a crown fire regime may in the future be influenced by a mixed severity fire regime. How can we manage forests to emulate mixed severity fire? We have some guidelines to look for. The Americans did a really nice study called Demonstration of Ecosystem Management Options, or DEMO, and developed some innovative techniques using green tree retention aggregated and dispersed at various levels, and various post-harvesting treatments to accelerate the return of standing and down woody debris on the landscape. If we can figure out what the historical structure and composition of these things might have looked like, that provides a tool that, that licensees can use to try and emulate that through forest harvesting, which might ultimately have implications for things like certification. So, management challenges and opportunities. These were just a few of the things that popped into my mind. I hope that you guys will see, hopefully you'll see more opportunities than I saw, but I suspect that you will also see more challenges because you're embedded in this in a way that I, having been forced to relocate to Guelph, Ontario, am not. So ecological restoration is a really obvious one. Once we find out where mixed severity fires historically occurred, and what types of structures and compositions they generated, this is a tool that NGOs, parks, and licensees striving to achieve certification might consider using as a tool, or as a target rather, for restoration efforts. Species conservation is another big one. We have reason to believe that these mixed severity fires produce distinct habitat types from either of their endpoints. It seems very likely that some species are probably obligate dependent on those structures and composition. And one likely candidate is the woodland caribou that typically likes having some forest cover but needs a relatively open forest because of their antlers. For licensees and policy developers, job site safety is a critical one because what we're probably talking about, ultimately recommending, is green tree retention and snag production, which obviously has implications for job site safety. This is why people have this, one of the big arguments for doing clear-cut logging in the first place is that it's the only safe way to get trees down. And then lastly, I see environmental certification as an emerging issue here. If we as ecologists come along and say these sites would historically have been characterized by mixed severity fire that would have produced these types of structures that we believe these species are obligate dependent on, ultimately licensees are going to have to take that into consideration when they're harvesting if they want to maintain certification. Anyway, that is my perspective as a ivory-towered academic here. But the one thing that I like to emphasize when I'm talking to people who actually make decisions or actually manage land is that just because something is does not mean that it should be. We as ecologists can tell you what the historical natural fire regime was like in terms of frequency, severity, effects, and resulting composition and structure. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's how you should be managing this landscape. You may have other objectives like job site safety or lifeboating the woodland caribou, preventing that from going extinct. What we can do is provide you with a range of scenarios that are consistent with what happened naturally. But obviously, we're not trying to tell you how to do your jobs. We're trying to give you information that you guys can use to do your jobs better. Anyway, to summarize, mixed severity fire is probably a more important process than was historically appreciated. However, understanding mixed severity fire is going to require new tools, new techniques, and some really clever graduate students. We've got at least one of those. That would be the third. And then lastly, reintroducing mixed severity fire or developing surrogates for mixed severity fire will be both a challenge and ultimately an opportunity. I think that licensees who are ahead of the curve in terms of thinking about mixed severity fire will be ahead of the curve when certification standards change. Anyway, if you're interested in these sorts of things, buy my book. It's dirt cheap on Amazon. I think we've sold like 7 copies of it. Anyway, that's, I don't even think I have a pretty picture to end it. Well, that's pretty enough. That'll do. All right. Thank you.